So anyway, glad to be here. Sorry to be here without my friend Aaron Pincus, who's currently in the Florida Keys. If you know Aaron, you can probably imagine what his situation is like at the moment. Trevor invited me here to talk about the book that Aaron and I recently wrote called The Interpersonal Situation, Contemporary Integrative Interpersonal Theory, Assessment, and Psychotherapy. So I'm going to present that book today. I'll start out with kind of like what we think about in terms of interpersonal theory, um, and contrast it with sort of mainstream ways of thinking about clinical psychology and psychiatry. So the questions that we ask, that psychologists ask about their clients are things like, what is this person like? Why do they do the things that they do? Why do they have the problems that they have? And what can we do to help them? And we answer these questions by getting to know people, armed with assessment techniques and therapeutic strategies. And then we help them achieve their goals with a treatment plan that's delivered within a therapeutic relationship. And yet, mainstream psychology and psychiatry sort of ignore the context within which problems exist. Um, uh, when they define problems in living or psychopathology in mainstream psychiatry, the descriptions are kind of in a vacuum without systematic reference to context. And when treatment strategies are described there that are not explicitly relational, they're described as if they work the same way for everyone and as if they're delivered in the same way by all clinicians. So interpersonal theory makes a radically different assumption. Harry Stack Sullivan, as you know, defined personality and in his model, psychopathology, as the recurrent pattern of interpersonal situations that characterize a life, right? So it's not so much about opening up a person's brain or mind or subjective experience and figuring out their scores on different dimensions and then classifying them based on that pattern of scores. It's about observing how people interact with their world primarily being social because we're a social species. And this is a different way of thinking about what people are like. It's not so much what people are like inside of themselves, it's what are people like in terms of the patterns of relationship they have with others, with objects in their world. And so for the last few years, Aaron and his students and myself have been trying to think about like, well, what are interpersonal situations? What constitutes interpersonal situations? What would the variables be that are in interpersonal situations? Or another way of asking this question would be something like, if you were watching two people interact, or if you were interacting with somebody and you stopped time and you had to answer the question like, what's going on right now? What would you need to know in order to answer that question? How would you be able to figure out why what's happening right now is related to the past and how it predicts the future? And we assert that if you were able to answer these 8 questions, you'd have a pretty good grip on what's happening. First two, what are you doing and what I'm doing in terms of observable features like how loud are you talking? Are you talking? What do you look like? What are you doing behaviorally? What words are you using? How do you feel and how do I feel? What do you want? What are you trying to get out of this relationship or out of this situation? And what do I want? And finally, how do you see things and how do I see things relative to each other or relative to like an objective observer? And this picture is an effort to try to systematize these questions by connecting them to measurement frameworks that are commonly used in psychological research. The idea of this model really was to try to balance two things. On the one hand, to make it complex enough that it would have a variable that represented the psychological dimension that would help you answer each of the questions on the left side of the screen. But on the other hand, that's simple enough that with a little bit of practice, it could be internalized as a kind of heuristic model so that as you're interacting with a person, you kind of have a working formulation in your mind that could guide how to respond to them in a certain way that would achieve certain kinds of interpersonal goals or therapeutic goals or whatever. So the model has a self and another because it's an interpersonal model. In interpersonal theory, the other can be another human being who's interacting with you in a proximal situation. It can also be another human being who's in your memory or fantasy. It can be another aspect of yourself, such as when you're angry with yourself or proud of yourself. It can be a non-human animal. It can be an inanimate object, so long as you have some kind of desire, some kind of attachment, some kind of affect about. So if you think about your childhood home or your hometown or your favorite meal, that can be a psychologically important other. For the sake of this, we'll talk about actual human interactions. In an interaction, there's a self and another, and both have things that they want. We call that the self system and organize that around agency and communion. So people want to get ahead, people want to get along, they might want to get away, they might want to put the other person in a position of power. Um, these are very broad dimensions, of course. In some models like SASB or social determination theory, agency kind of splits into a more achievement kind of agency and a more autonomy kind of agency. That's a world that I'm happy to live in, depending on what you're trying to do. But I stick with circles for the most part, and that allows me to get most of the things done that I want to get done. The other part that's in each person is the affect system. So we have feelings. We arrange that with the arousal valence two-dimensional circumplicial model. I find that easy to think about in terms of like how many feelings is a person having and are they generally good or bad? You could use positive and negative affect if you like that better, or discrete emotions or whatever is your preference. And then there's a double-headed arrow between the two, which signifies that there's a reciprocal relationship between the two. So you have feelings because they signal goals or goal frustration potentially. And then the other hand, when a motive emerges, it usually triggers an affect that's designed to promote certain kinds of behavioral patterns. Between the two people is behavior. There's our old friend, the interpersonal circle, structured by dominance and warmth. Of course, both people can be plotted on the interpersonal circle, and so you would generally tend to expect complementary patterns where dominance is associated with submission and warmth with warmth across people. And finally, as two people are interacting, one person perceives the other and the other perceives the first, and both people have to have some level of perception of themselves. Um, and so the idea is that this model kind of describes all the pieces that you would kind of need to keep track of in a psychologically measurable and tractable way if you wanted to answer the question, like what's happening right now? Why do we think it's happening? What do they think we could do to change it, etc. But interpersonal theory, starting with Sullivan's definition, doesn't stop with a kind of static description of what's happening at any one point in time or what a person's like in general. So you could use a model like this to sort of do a personality assessment and say, well, this person tends to be dominant and cold and has high valence emotions and tends to have agentic goals, and they tend to trigger communal motives in the other person, et cetera. Well, that person probably wouldn't do that. But anyway, you could do that. You could sort of paint a static portrait of a person using this model, but what we tend to do is to go one step past that and describe what's been called interpersonal signatures. This is kind of like if you knew the key signature and the time signature and all the notes that were played in a song, you still wouldn't know very much about like what the song sounded like, right? Like you'd want the melody at minimum and maybe some harmonies and the difference between the verse and the chorus, etc. You can stretch the metaphor too far, I suppose, but the idea is that it's not just what a person's like in general that counts from an interpersonal perspective, but rather the pattern of behavior that tends to be associated in a clinical context, tends to be associated with problems. And of course, people have different patterns of behavior. They don't always play out the same way every time. But the goal oftentimes in a clinical formulation is to figure out, okay, but what is the general form of the core pattern that is most associated with a person's problems? Um, and so one way to formulate this, as you'll see throughout the talk, there's different ways to do this, but one way to do this is to kind of take each part or each system within the interpersonal situation model that I just showed you and turn them into a sequence. This isn't meant to assert that the sequence happens the same way every time. We're not making strong assumptions about the time scale of the sequence. It's again a kind of heuristic model of like what is the pattern that's associated with the person's problem. So in this case, for example, if I'm the self, is indicated by an S. If you're the other, is indicated by the O. In the first bit there, the parentheses are meant to indicate that that's my perception of you, which may or may not be accurate. So I'm in a warm, submissive position. I want you to take care of me, but I perceive you as being in a cold, submissive position, sort of rejecting or ignoring me. That makes me anxious in the second stage. And now I have a conflicted motive. On the one hand, I want to be close to you. On the other hand, I'm afraid that if I get close to you, you might reject me. So I resolve that conflict by being aggressive. Why aren't you paying attention to me? Don't you care about me? What's wrong with you? Am I not good enough for you? That freaks you out because you experience that as a pretty weird thing for me to be saying. So you get anxious, you recoil, you do, in fact, behave in a cold, submissive way towards me, and that becomes a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy or projective identification or a vicious circle or whichever word you want to use for that concept. And that's a key idea from an interpersonal perspective, or at least the one that we're presenting, that normally behavior is adaptive. Normally, you learn through social patterns how to behave in the kinds of ways that get your goals met. Psychopathology, one way to think about what psychopathology is from an interpersonal perspective is patterns that don't end up causing the kind of learning that's adaptive, but rather reinforce maladaptive patterns like the one that you see here. So there's a long list of books articulating interpersonal theory, beginning, of course, with Sullivan through Leary and Kiesler and Benjamin and Horowitz and others. It's been a while since one has been published, and since then, evidence has accumulated and ideas have developed. Contemporary integrative interpersonal theory is kind of one variation of a broad class of interpersonal theories that Aaron and his students and I have been, and several others have been writing chapters and papers about. And the problem we had was like, there's never been enough room to put everything in the same place. And so we thought, well, maybe that's that's what we should try to do. And in fact, you can't fit everything. And so we kind of had to make a choice early on. One version of a book like this could be something like a review of the literature and evidence that supports different interpersonal principles, hypotheses, concepts, etc. That the Kiesler book was a lot like that, and this was one of my favorite books in graduate school. That's not the track that we took, so of course we cite research evidence. Aaron's mentioned the possibility of trying to update the Kiesler book, and so we'll see if that happens. Um, that's not what we tried to do. Our goal was really to write a book for clinicians and students to become familiar with the model, to be able to use it clinically. And so there's a heavy emphasis on clinical examples throughout. Here's Aaron to tell you about the contents of the book. First half is about the theory. So there's an introduction, a sort of a description of the definitions and concepts and principles and assumptions of the model, a description of an interpersonal conception of psychopathology. And then one of the first I in CIIT is integrative. And one of the themes that we really tried to weave throughout the book was that contemporary negative interpersonal theory is not meant to be a perspective like that is distinguished against other theories of personality or psychopathology or psychotherapy. So it's not meant to compete with sort of with trait or social cognitive theories of personality or different high top or DSM models of psychopathology or cognitive behavioral or dynamic models of psychotherapy. Rather, it's a model that tries to integrate these different perspectives through the lens of interpersonal situations or relationships. And so in chapter 4, we try to illustrate that by showing how you would think about common mental health constructs, personality, and psychopathology variables from the interpersonal situation perspective. And then the second half is a more applied part of the book. We talk about assessment, intervention, and then again, we close with a kind of pitch about how we're not proposing a new brand of psychotherapy, but rather a way of thinking about different clinical techniques through a common integrative lens. Throughout the book, we use 4 examples to try to illustrate various points and concepts. The examples are listed here. At the top of this slide, you can see their demographic characteristics. I guess I'd just draw your attention to the bottom of the slide, actually, where we tried to spread interpersonal theory across constructs, personality disorder, delusional disorder, depression, generalized anxiety, and across treatment types, including psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, acceptance and commitment, et cetera, kinds of therapy. So the idea was to use each of these cases through all of the chapters to illustrate the various points. And that becomes more intense towards the end, where we provide full description of their assessments and treatments in the last couple of chapters. Okay, so the first bit is about assumptions. Aaron first listed assumptions in his book in his chapter in the Lenzenweger and Clarkin book in 2005, I think, which is one of the most important papers I ever read because it's what got me to SITAR, for example, and I might not know most of you if that hadn't happened. At that time, he had 4, and they've kind of been tweaked and modified and expanded, et cetera. And I'm not sure that we're satisfied with them yet, but These are the kind of foundations upon which contemporary integrative interpersonal theory rests. The first one is just a restatement of Sullivan's definition of personality, that we think about personality and psychopathology as occurring in interpersonal situations. The second is the shout out to the circle. You can organize interpersonal functioning using agency and communion. Third, agency and communion manifest in multiple ways. This traces back to Leary's 1957 book, which was organized around different what he called levels of functioning that can be assessed with different kinds of measurement approaches. It also reflects the current practice of assessing different surfaces of interpersonal functioning using questionnaires that are designed to assess traits and problems and efficacies and strengths and values, etc. The fourth is that satisfying agentic and communal motives drives interpersonal behavior. I think of Len Horowitz when I think about this assumption. The idea is that we're all trying to do something. We all behave with one another. We all go into the world with some kind of motive driving our behavior. Of course, we may or may not be conscious. We're usually not fully conscious of our motives, but there's purpose, there's intention into what we're trying to do, and that drives the entire system. And from that ground spring of intention comes these transaction cycles, like the one that I showed you a moment ago. And so what's interesting about people and what's diagnostic about problems from an interpersonal perspective is these patterns, these sequences of behavior that are systematic, that recur across situations systematically, particularly when they're associated with problems. And our argument is that you can use the interpersonal situation model to provide a reasonably comprehensive description of those patterns. And finally, that sustained deviations from developmentally and socioculturally expected patterns may or likely reflect psychopathology. This can include frustrated goals or doing things that people don't expect, or a variety of other kinds of problems that are understood as occurring within the patterns that people have as they interact with others. So from that, the definition of psychopathology becomes fairly simple. It's distortion in the perceptual system or dysregulation in the self, affect, or behavioral systems. One important point about dysregulation, we don't mean by that high scores on variables. So we don't mean by that like lots of negative affect or being too dominant or whatever. It can mean having too many negative affects as one element of affective dysregulation. But it could also include having a position at two different places on the same dimension at the same time, which would be something like motivational conflict, for example. It can include patterns of variability that are not adaptive or normative for your context. It can include within-person contingencies that are non-normative or otherwise maladaptive. So it's not so much that we would like the profile of your favorite self-report multidimensional questionnaire, like look for high or low scores across these dimensions, but rather different sort of forms of pattern that could indicate dysregulation. And again, ultimately, the idea is to figure out what a sequence for a person might be. You can depict that sequence in multiple ways. A minute ago, I showed that sequence sort of displayed across the screen as a bunch of different parts. You can also do that within the original model. In this case, I'll just read you from the book, The Case of Ruth, one of the four people that I mentioned before, and show you how it works in this picture. Ruth is chronically suspicious of others and experiences transient referential thinking. This is likely due to an underlying biologically based psychotic illness, potentially reinforced by traumatic learning related to her husband's infidelity and abandonment. In many interpersonal situations, she tends to distort her perception and construal of others' intentions and behaviors as potentially threatening and malevolent, and herself as endangered. So that's the very first bit there. She sees herself as endangered and others as threatening. For example, she began to feel as though church sermons were chastising her and members of her congregation were judging her as a sinner. Ruth became fearful and ashamed. That's the second step of the sequence here, which evoked a self-protective motive to flee. That's the third. So she stopped attending church with no explanation to her family or her congregation. That's the detachment behavior as the fourth step. Her community's behavior became increasingly cold towards her, or only superficially or patronizingly warm, and eventually all but her close family drifted away, leaving Ruth more isolated and suspicious. This maladaptive pattern of perceived threat, increased insecurity, and decreased self-esteem, followed by detachment, and eventual relationship disillusion had become a socially reinforced vicious circle. So that's kind of the idea is like, what's the core pattern that generalizes across relationships? Um, one concept that is not new, but we emphasized in the book is the difference between primary and self-protective motives. Primary motive being a fairly adaptive motive that is that is likely to occur when a person is not under threat, and a self-protective motive being a motive that occurs to sort of bolster the self system when security or self-esteem are threatened. Self-protective motives have also been called defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms, etc. These motives are particularly important in psychopathology because oftentimes they're pretty closely linked with the kinds of problems people are having in their lives. Okay, so you can kind of lay this out as a list of words, and this is maybe one way to have an interpersonal formulation in which the columns indicate what kind of dysregulation and distortion the person's experiencing, and then how that eventuates in a vicious cycle or a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in Ruth's case, she perceives herself as threatened because other people are dangerous. She has a fear and shame response, which motivates her to avoid the threat by isolating herself. And then when she isolates, it works. She's no longer under threat, and so the strategy is reinforced. And at the same time, other people think she's being weird, so they gossip about her, and that confirms her suspicion that people are dangerous and that they don't care about her. Okay, so that's kind of the model of psychopathology. And as I mentioned, one thing we do, I think we have about like 25 or 30 common constructs in the personality and psychopathology literature that we just kind of illustrate. This is in part based on evidence in the literature and in part based on us just kind of putting together how we would think about things. One trouble is that many constructs are pretty heterogeneous, and so you this works fairly well for an individual human being. For the kind of sloppy constructs that we have to deal with in psychology and psychiatry, it only kind of works. So it's just kind of an illustration, but here, just as an example, is depression, and I'll again read from the book. Oh, I should mention, I've already said like there's different ways to represent patterns using this figure. I've shown you two, and here's yet a third. And this one I use special tricks like the oval indicates that a person could be in different parts of the circle at the same time. The arrows mean that over time people are changing their behavior as they interact with somebody. So I'll show you what I mean now. Cognitive distortions about the self, that's number one, and the environment and others, that's number two. Trigger depressed affect, that's number three. That's closely connected with a deep and ingrained sense of falling short or being perceived as falling short in some way, depending on whether the primary motivational factors involve communion or agency. So there's these models of individual differences in depression, right, from people like Blatt and Beck that say that like there's like two reasons to be depressed. You can either not think you're good enough or you can think people don't like you enough. So that's what that four is sort of meant to indicate. Usually it's some combination of low agency, low communion, but it's not always clear. People vary in that way. They also vary in their behavior. Research has shown that behavioral patterns of depressed people tend to be pathoplastic, but it commonly ranges between coldness and submissiveness. So that big five is meant to indicate that behaviorally depressed people could be anywhere on the circle, although probabilistically they're more likely to be cold and submissive than anything else. The other person experiences negative and increasingly high arousal emotions. Other people's depression tends to freak you out. And over time, they sort of lose their taste in being close. And so they go from a sort of warm empathic position to a sort of cold and potentially even dominant position. So oftentimes it plays out like this, and this is what the curved arrow 8 is meant to indicate. The initial strategy is like, okay, empathic concern, right? Something seems wrong. What do you want to talk about it? How's it going? If that doesn't work, the next strategy might be some kind of more dominant encouragement. Why don't we go out and have a good time? Maybe you'll enjoy yourself. And then when that doesn't work, frustration can start setting in, and a cold dominant sort of strategy can set in. What's wrong with you? It feels like I'm trying to help you more than you're trying to help yourself. So people who care about the depressed person usually aren't trying to end up in a cold dominant complementary position to the cold submissive depressed person. But the forces of psychopathology and complementarity can sometimes be stronger than their intention. And so the press person sort of starts out feeling as though people don't care about them or they're not good enough, and then they evoke the kinds of behaviors in others that confirm the belief. So this is one example, and again, we do this across a number of different examples of constructs in the literature. Moving into the assessment chapter, which we structure around four principles. The first one is use circles to organize interpersonal process data. The second is to assess multiple surfaces. The third, to use multiple methods. And the fourth, to assess people across multiple timescales. These are idealistic principles in certain clinical situations, but that's the way that we recommend doing it. So we first try to describe for people what the difference is between a circumplex and other kinds of model. This I find is like not that confusing once you get used to it, but I mean, I'm sure many of you have also had the experience of like what's with these circles and all this weird geometry. And I think it's a real barrier sometimes for people. They just, you're this weird circle person or whatever. So we try to describe this in a simple way. The bottom line is that there's certain domains like color and emotion and interpersonal behavior that are circular in nature. And so it's best to use measurement tools that can represent that. One of the advantages of doing that has to do with interstitial content. So like in a simplex world, if you do a factor analysis and you want to get relatively independent factors, then you want to get rid of any items that cross-load. And so if you were measuring depression and anxiety, you might get rid of an item like I'm distressed because it loads on both of those scales, and that would be bad. Arguably, knowing if a person's distressed is useful information. So from a circumplex perspective, you wouldn't get rid of an item like that. You would just make a scale that has a 45-degree relationship with the two orthogonal scales, like I like to help people is about halfway between dominance and warmth, for example. So anyway, you all know this stuff. But we try to lay out in the book like why circles are not that weird, and in fact they have some advantages. And having done that, we then describe the structural summary approach to summarizing interpersonal circumplex questionnaires, most of which have 8 scales and representing each octant of the circle, and that allows you to decompose them using this 4-parameter model. The first parameter is elevation. So if we use the inventory of interpersonal problems as an example, elevation basically means the average score across all items, which can be interpreted as like how distressed the person is or how many problems they're reporting having. In this example, if 50, if these are T-scores, I guess, and so this person has a T-score of 55 in elevation, so they're a little more distressed than an average person. Um, when when the pattern of scores looks like a nice wave like this, then um, that's handy, and you can tell that by the R-square coefficient or the coefficient of fit. That just tells you how similar is the profile of scores on the profile you're looking at to a perfect sine wave like the one you're looking at on the screen. Um, and amplitude indicates the variation across scores. So the sort of specificity, is it the case that the person has a high score in one kind of problem and low scores in others? When there's a nice wave like this, then amplitude can be interpreted as the distance between the peak of the wave and the elevation. And then in that case, displacement can mean the angle at which that peak occurs, which is the interpersonal theme. Like that's what allows you to say this person's cold or dominant or warm or whatever. And then we illustrate these parameters by showing instances of high versus low scores on each over here. So when you plot an interpersonal circumplex measure and you get a really nice wave like this, it looks like a spaceship on the circle. So in this case, you've got 2 spaceships that are the same shape, same displacement, roughly same amplitude. The only difference is that this has got a bigger elevation than that. The spaceship is bigger, right? So this person has more interpersonal problems than that one. In this case, the amplitude and elevation are the same. The spaceships are equally big. They're the same shape, but one's pointing north and one is pointing west. So this person has cold problems. This person has primarily dominant problems. And then in this example, this person has no amplitude, meaning they have the same score across all octants. It wouldn't make much sense to talk about this person's angular displacement because all scores are similar, whereas when you get this nice spaceship-shaped figure, then you can say, well, this person's dominant. Okay, so we try to walk people through the structural summary. We then move on to the surfaces. There are now interpersonal circumplex measures for traits, problems, motives, values, goals, sensitivities, efficacies, strengths, behaviors, impact messages, and tactics. We review the literature on those measures, and we present a couple of cases illustrating multi-surface interpersonal assessment, the virtue of which is that if you give measures assessing these different levels or surfaces of interpersonal constructs, sometimes you get different scores across different surfaces. And so this would be missed in a world where you think of agency and communion as traits, where a person can only have one score. It's possible for a person to be really good at something that is also a problem for them, as one example. Okay. Um, to accompany the book, we created a calculator. I know that there's maybe other calculators floating around in the world. This one can be used to assess the four surfaces that we use most often. As an example, I've listed the IIP. So there's the items here, there's the scores with the scale. You can download this from my website, and you could either have a person fill it out, or you could fill it out yourself. You get scores for the IIP, structural summary scores, a profile, and then there's a page with visualizations that allow you to do multi-scale, a multi-surface interpersonal assessment. So again, the link is there. You can find it on my website or email me or whatever, and it will also be listed in the book. We conclude the chapter again in the spirit of integration, showing how scales from common assessment instruments like the MMPI or PAI or RPAS would relate to distortion and dysregulation in the model, and by reviewing research on ambulatory and observational assessment that can allow for measurement of people at different time scales, in this case, between situations and within situations. So that concludes the assessment bit. And at the end of the assessment chapter, we do a full assessment workup of each of the four cases, and that transitions into the psychotherapy chapter where we really start focusing pretty heavily on the clinical demonstrations. So we show how to use multi-method assessment data, including assessments of the therapeutic process, to generate an interpersonal formulation and treatment plan. We interpret different therapy orientations and techniques within the interpersonal situation, again, to try to illustrate that this model is not trying to compete with other perspectives, but rather provide a common language within which one can talk about different therapy orientations. And then we illustrate interpersonal strategies such as complementarity and meta communication that sort of come from within the interpersonal tradition, although they're similar to concepts in other traditions to achieve treatment goals. So I'll close by revisiting our friend Ruth, who you will recall perceived others as dangerous and herself as threatened. That made her anxious, and her response was to withdraw from the world. In the case, we use assessment data and therapy transcripts to illustrate how the therapist uses complementarity to disrupt this pattern. Initially and during moments of rupture, the therapist would compliment Ruth's cold submissiveness by being less warm than she would normally be with clients, and by structuring the treatment in a relatively distant and directive manner. So it's a little tricky to think about, like, what would be good psychotherapy in a cold dominant position, but I think there are ways to think about that. Over time, and when the alliance was more secure, Ruth's therapist would try to titrate little bits of warmth to the point that Ruth could tolerate more closeness, overcome her discomfort to the point that she herself could express genuine affection. And then the idea is that this enabled other treatment strategies within the therapy, but that Ruth also began to generalize her tolerance of closeness outside of therapy. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Here's Aaron again. My contact information is on this page. I think this book, which will be published by the APA, should be coming out sometime this spring. And maybe I'll send something around, hopefully with a discount or whatever. But hey, thanks for listening.